Prologue. The gods of the right-hand path have bickered and quarreled for an entire age of Earth. Each of these deities and their respective priests and ministers have attempted to find wisdom in their own lies. The Ice Age of religious thought can last but a limited time in this great scheme of human existence. The gods of wisdom defiled have had their saga and the millennium have become as reality. Each, with his own divine path to paradise, hath accused the other of heresies and spiritual indiscretions. The reign of the Nibelungen doth carry an everlasting curse, only because those who seek it think in terms of good and evil, themselves being at all times good. The gods of the past have become as their own devils in order to live. Feebly their ministers play the devil's game to fill their tabernacles and pay the mortgages on their temples. Alas, too long have they studied righteousness, and poor and incompetent devils they make. So they all join hands in brotherly unity, and in their desperation go to Valhalla for their last great ecumenical council. Draweth near in the gloom of the twilight of the gods. The ravens of night have flown forth to summon Loki, who hath set Valhalla aflame with the searing trident of the inferno. The twilight is done, the glow of new light is born out of the night, and Lucifer is risen once more to proclaim, this is the age of Satan. Satan rules the earth. The gods of the unjust are dead. This is the morning of magic and undefiled wisdom. The flesh prevaileth, and a great church shall be builded, consecrated in its name. No longer shall man's salvation be dependent on his self-denial. It will be known that the world of the flesh and the living shall be the greatest preparation for any and all eternal delights. Regi Satanas, Ave Satanas, Hail Satan. The 9 Satanic statements. 1. Satan represents indulgence instead of abstinence. 2. Satan represents vital existence instead of spiritual pipe dreams. 3. Satan represents undefiled wisdom instead of hypocritical self-deceit. 4. Satan represents kindness to those who deserve it instead of love wasted on ingrates. 5. Satan represents vengeance instead of turning the other cheek. 6. Satan represents responsibility to the responsible instead of concern for slaying vampires. 7. Satan represents man as just another animal, sometimes better, more often worse than those that walk on all fours who, because of his divine spiritual and intellectual development, has become the most vicious animal of all. 8. Satan represents all of the so-called sins, as they have all lead to physical, mental, or emotional gratification. 9. Satan has been the best friend the church has ever had, as he has kept it in business all these years. Fire, the Book of Satan, the Infernal Diatribe. The first book of the Satanic Bible is not an attempt to blaspheme as much as it is a statement of what might be termed diabolical indignation. The devil has been attacked by the men of God relentlessly without reservation. Never has there been an opportunity short of fiction for the Dark Prince to speak out in the same manner as the spokesman of the Lord of the Righteous. The pulpit pounders of the past have been free to define good and evil as they see fit, and have gladly smashed into oblivion any who disagree with their lies, both verbally and at times physically. Their talk of charity, when applied to his infernal majesty, becomes an empty sham, and most unfairly too, considering the obvious fact that without their satanic foe, their very religions would collapse. How sad that the allegorical personage most responsible for the success of spiritual religions is shown the least amount of charity and the most consistent news, and by those who most unctuously preach the rules of fair play. For all the centuries of shouting down the devil has received, he has never shouted back at his detractors. He has remained a gentleman at all times. While those who support his rant and rave, he has shown himself to be a model of deportment. But now he feels it is time to shout back. He has decided it is finally time to receive his due. Now the ponderous rulebooks of hypocrisy are no longer needed. In order to relearn the law of the jungle, a small, slim diatribe will do. Each verse is an inferno. Each word is a tongue of fire. of your printed idols do I bend in acquiescence, and he who saith, Thou shalt to me, is my mortal foe. I dip my forefinger in the watery blood of your mad Redeemer, and write over his thorn-torn brow, the true Prince of Evil, the King of Slaves. No hoary falsehood shall be a truth to me. No stifling dogma shall encramp my pen. I break away from all convictions that do not lead to my earthly success and happiness. I raise up in stern invasion the standard of the strong. I gaze into the glassy eye of your fearsome Jehovah and pluck him by the beard. I uplift a broad axe and split open his worm skull. I blasted out the ghastly contents, philosophically righted sepulchres, and laugh with sardonic wrath. Lotusine 2. Behold the crucifix. What does it symbolize? Pallid incompetence hanging on a tree. I question all things. As I stand before the festering and varnished facades of your Hagia's moral dogmas, I write thereon in letters of blazing scorn. Lo and behold, all this is fraud. Gather round me, oh, ye death defiant, and the earth itself shall be thine, to have and to hold. Too long the dead hand has been permitted to sterilize living thought. Too long right and wrong, good and evil have been inverted by false prophets. No creed must be accepted upon authority of a divine nature. Religions must be put to the question. No moral dogma must be taken for granted. No standard of measurement defied. There is nothing inherently sacred about moral codes. Like the wooden idols of long ago, they are the work of human hands, and what man has made, man can destroy. He that is slow to believe anything and everything is of great understanding, for belief in one false principle is the beginning of all unwisdom. The chief duty of every new age is to praise new men to determine its liberties, to lead it towards material success, to rend the rusty padlocks and chains of dead custom that always prevent healthy expansion. Theories and ideas that may have meant life and hope and freedom for our ancestors now mean destruction, slavery, and dishonor to us. As environments change, no human idea standeth sure. Whenever, therefore, a lie has built unto itself a throne, let it be assailed without pity and without regret, for under the domination of an inconvenient falsehood, no one can prosper. Let established sophisms be dethroned, rooted out, burnt and destroyed, for they are a standing menace to all true nobility of thought and action. Whatever alleged truth is proven by results to be but an empty fiction, let it be unceremoniously flung into the outer darkness among the dead gods, dead empires, dead philosophies, and other useless lumber and wreckage. The most dangerous of all enthroned lies is the holy, the sanctified, the privileged lie. The lie everyone believes to be a model truth. It is the fruitful mother of all other popular errors and delusions. It is a hydra-headed tree of unreason with 1,000 roots. It is a social cancer. The lie that is known to be a lie is half eradicated, but the lie that even intelligent persons accept as fact, the lie that has been inculcated in a little child at its mother's knee, is more dangerous to contend against than a creeping pestilence. Popular lies have ever been the most potent enemies of personal liberty. There is only one way to deal with them. Cut them out, to the very core, just as cancers. Exterminate them, root and branch. Annihilate them, or they will us. Liberation 3. Love one another. It has been said is the supreme law. But what power made it so? On what rational authority does the gospel of love rest? Why should I not hate mine enemies? If I love them, does that not place me at their mercy? Is it natural for enemies to do good unto each other? And what is good? Can the torn and bloody victim love the blood-splashed jaws that rend him limb from limb? Are we not all predatory animals by instinct? If humans ceased wholly from preying upon each other, could they continue to exist? Is not lust and carnal desire a more truthful term to describe love when applied to the continuance of the race? Is not the love of the farming scriptures simply a euphemism for sexual activity, or was the great teacher a glorifier of eunuchs? Love your enemies and do good to them that hate and use you. Is this not the despicable philosophy of the spaniel that rolls upon its back when kicked? Hate your enemies with a whole heart, and if a man smite you on one cheek, smash him on the other. Smite him hip and thigh, for self-preservation is the highest law. He who turns the other cheek is a cowardly dog. Give blow for blow, scorn for scorn, doom for doom, with compound interest liberally added thereunto. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, eye fourfold, 100-fold. Make yourself a terror to your adversary, and when he goeth his way, he will possess much additional wisdom to ruminate over. Thus shall you make yourself respected in all the walks of life, and your spirit, your immortal spirit, shall live, not in an intangible paradise, but in the brains and sinews of those whose respect you have gained. The 4. Life is the great indulgence, death the great abstinence. Therefore, make the most of life, here and now. There is no heaven of glory bright, and no hell where sinners roast. Here and now is our day of torment. Here and now is our day of joy. Here and now is our opportunity. Choose ye this day, this hour, for no redeemer liveth. Say unto thine own heart, I am mine own redeemer. Stop the way of them that would persecute you. Let those who devise thine undoing be hurled back to the confusion and infamy. Let them be as chaff before the cyclone, and after they have fallen, rejoice in thine own salvation. Then all thy bones shall say pridefully, Who is like unto me? Have I not been too strong for mine adversaries? Have I not delivered myself by my own brain? The Book of Psalm 5. Blessed are the strong, for they shall possess the earth. Cursed are the weak, for they shall inherit the yoke. Blessed are the powerful, for they shall be reverenced among men. Cursed are the feeble, for they shall be blotted out. Blessed are the bold, for they shall be masters of the world. Cursed are the righteously humble, for they shall be trodden under cloven hoofs. Blessed are the victorious, for victory is the basis of right. Cursed are the vanquished, for they shall be vassals forever. Blessed are the iron-handed, for the unfit shall flee before them. Cursed are the poor in spirit, for they shall be spat upon. Blessed are the death-defiant, for their days shall be long in the land. Cursed are the gazers toward a richer life beyond the grave, for they shall perish amidst plenty. Blessed are the destroyers of false hope, for they are the true messiahs. Cursed are the God-adorers, for they shall be shorn sheep. Blessed are the valiant, for they shall obtain great treasure. Cursed are the believers in good and evil, for they are frightened by shadows. Blessed are those that believe in what is best for them, for never shall their minds be terrorized. Cursed are the lambs of God, for they shall be bled whiter than snow. Blessed is the man who has a sprinkling of enemies, for they shall make him a hero. Cursed is he who doeth good unto others, who sneer upon him in return, for he shall be despised. Blessed are the mighty-minded, for they shall ride the whirlwinds. Cursed are they who teach lies for truth and truth for lies, for they are an abomination. Thrice cursed are the weak, whose insecurity makes them vile, for they shall serve and suffer. The angel of self-defeat is camped in the souls of the righteous. The eternal flame of power through joy dwelleth within the flesh of the Satanist. Air, the book of Lucifer, the enlightenment. The Roman god Lucifer was the bearer of light, the spirit of the air, the personification of enlightenment. In Christian mythology, he became synonymous with evil, which is only to have been expected from a religion whose very existence is perpetuated by clouded definitions and bogus values. It is time to set the record straight. False moralisms and occult inaccuracies must be corrected. Entertaining as they might be, most stories and plays about devil worship must be recognized as the obsolete absurdities they are. It has been said, the truth will make men free. The truth alone has never set anyone free. It is only doubt which will bring mental emancipation. Without the wonderful element of doubt, the doorway through which truth passes will be tightly shut, impervious to the most strenuous poundings of 1,000 Lucifers. How understandable that Holy Scripture should refer to the infernal monarch as the father of lies, a magnificent example of character inversion. One is to believe this theological accusation that the devil represents all spiritual religions and who wrote all of the Holy Bibles. When one doubt is followed by another, the bubble, grown large from long accumulated fallacies, threatens to burst. For those who already doubt supposed truths, this book is revelation. Then Lucifer will have risen. Now is the time for doubt. The bubble of falsehood is bursting, and its sound is the roar of the world. Wanted, God, dead or alive. It is a popular misconception that the Satanist does not believe in God. The concept of God as interpreted by man has been so varied throughout the ages that the Satanist simply accepts the definition which suits him best. Man has always created his gods, rather than his gods creating him. God is, to some, benign, to others, terrifying. To the Satanist, God, by whatever name he is called or by no name at all, is seen as the balancing factor in nature and not as being concerned with suffering. This powerful force which permeates and balances the universe is far too impersonal to care about the happiness or misery of flesh and blood creatures on this ball of dirt upon which we live. Anyone who thinks of Satan as evil should consider all the men, women, children, and animals who have died because it was God's will. Certainly a person grieving the untimely loss of a loved one would much rather have their loved one with them than in God's hands. Instead, they are unctuously consoled by their clergyman who says, "It was God's will, my dear," or "He is in God's hands now, my son." Such phrases have been a convenient way for religionists to condone or excuse the mercilessness of God. But if God is in complete control and as benign as he is supposed to be, why does he allow these things to happen? Too long have religionists been falling back on their Bibles and rulebooks to prove or disprove, justify, condemn, or interpret. The Satanist realizes that man and the action and reaction of the universe is responsible for everything and doesn't mislead himself into thinking that someone cares. No longer will we sit back and accept fate without doing anything about it just because it says so in chapter such and such, psalm so and so, and that's that. The Satanist knows that praying does absolutely no good. In fact, it actually lessens the chance of success, for the devoutly religious too often sit back complacently and pray for a situation which, if they were to do something about it on their own, could be accomplished much quicker. The Satanist shuns terms such as hope and prayer as they are indicative of apprehension. If we hope and pray for something to come about, we will not act in a positive way which will make it happen. The Satanist realizing that anything he gets is of his own doing, takes command of the situation instead of praying to God for it to happen. Positive thinking and positive action add up to the results. Just as the Satanist does not pray to God for assistance, he does not pray for forgiveness for his wrongs. In other religions, when one commits a wrong, he either prays to God for forgiveness or confesses to an intermediary and asks him to pray to God for forgiveness for his sins. The Satanist knows that praying does no good. Confessing to another human being like himself accomplishes even less and is furthermore degrading. When a Satanist commits a wrong, he realizes that it is natural to make mistakes, and if he is truly sorry about what he has done, he will learn from it and take care not to do the same thing again. If he is not honestly sorry about what he has done and knows he will do the same thing over and over, he has no business confessing and asking for forgiveness in the first place. But this is exactly what happens. People confess their sins so that they can clear their consciences and be free to go out and sin again, usually the same sin. There are many different interpretations of God in the usual sense of the word, as there are types of people. The images run from a belief in God into some vague sort of universal cosmic mind, to an anthropomorphic deity with a long white beard and sandals who keeps right-hand path because their religions carry different labels, and somehow this animosity must be released. What better way than through prayer? What a simpering, polite way of saying, I hate your guts. It's the thinly disguised device known as praying for your enemy. Praying for one's own enemy is nothing more than bargain-basement anger and of a decidedly shoddy and inferior quality. If there has been so much violent discrepancy as to the proper way in which to worship God, how many different interpretations of God can there be, and who is right? All devout white lighters are concerned with appeasing God so that they might have the pearly gates open for them when they die. Nevertheless, if a man has not lived his life in accordance with the regulations of his faith, he can at the last minute call a clergyman to his deathbed for a final absolution. The priest or minister will then come running on the devil to make everything right with God and see to it that his passport to the heavenly realm is in order. The Yazidis, a sect of devil worshippers, take a different viewpoint. They believe that God is all-powerful but also all-forgiving, and so accordingly feel that it is the devil that they must praise, as he is the one who rules their lives while here on earth. They believe so strongly that God will forgive all of their sins once they have been given the last rites, that they feel no need to concern themselves with the opinion God may hold of them while they live. With all of the contradictions in the Christian scriptures, many people currently cannot rationally accept Christianity the way it has been practiced in the past. Great numbers of people are beginning to doubt the existence of God in the established Christian sense of the word, so they have taken to calling themselves Christian atheists. True, the Christian Bible is a mass of contradictions, but what could be more contradictory than a Christian atheist? If prominent leaders of the Christian faith are rejecting the past interpretations of God, how can the followers be expected to adhere to previous religious tradition? With all debates about whether or not God is dead, if he isn't, he had better have Medicare. The God you say may be yourself. All religions of a spiritual nature are inventions of man. He has created an entire system of gods with nothing more than his carnal brain. Just because he has an ego and cannot accept it, he has to externalize it into some great spiritual device which he calls God. God can do all things that man is forbidden to do, such as kill people, perform miracles to gratify his will, control without any apparent responsibility, etc. If man needs such a God and recognizes that God, then he is worshipping an entity that a human being invented. Therefore, he is worshipping by proxy the man that invented God. Is it not more sensible to worship a God that he himself has created in accordance with his own emotional needs, one that represents the very carnal and physical being that has the idea power to invent a God in the first place? If man insists on externalizing his true self in the form of God, then why fear his true self in fearing God? Why praise his true self in praising God? Why remain externalized from God in order to engage in ritual and religious ceremony in his name? Man needs ritual and dogma, but no law states that an externalized God is necessary in order to engage in ritual and ceremony performed in the God's name. Could it be that when he closes the gap between himself and his God, he sees the demon of pride creeping forth, that very embodiment of Lucifer appearing in his midst? He no longer can view himself in two parts, the carnal and the spiritual, but sees them merge as one, and then to his abysmal horror discovers that they are only the carnal and always were. Then he either hates himself to death, day by day, or rejoices that he is what he is. If he hates himself, he searches out new and more complex spiritual paths of enlightenment in hopes that he may split himself up again in his quest for stronger and more externalized gods to scourge his poor miserable shell. If he accepts himself but recognizes that the ritual and ceremony are the important devices that his invented religions have utilized to sustain his faith in a lie, then it is the same form of ritual that will sustain his faith in the truth, the primitive pageantry that will give his awareness of his own majestic being and its substance. When all religious faith in lies has waned, it is because man has become closer to himself and farther from God, closer to the devil. If this is what the devil represents and a man lives his life in the devil's fame, with the sinews of Satan moving in his flesh, then he either escapes from the cacklings and carpings of the righteous or stands proudly in the secret places of the earth and manipulates the falling ridden masses through his own satanic might. Until that wants more than he already has. Envy means to look with favor upon the possessions of others and to be desirous of obtaining similar things for oneself. Envy and greed are the motivating forces of ambition, and without ambition, very little of any importance would be accomplished. Gluttony is simply eating more than you need to keep yourself alive. When you have overeaten to the point of obesity, another sin, pride, will motivate you to regain your self-respect. Anyone who buys an article of clothing for a purpose other than covering his body and protecting it from the elements is guilty of pride. Satanists often encounter scoffers who maintain that labels are not necessary. It must be pointed out to these destroyers of labels that one or many articles they themselves are wearing are not necessary to keep them moving. There is not a person on this earth who is completely devoid of ornamentation. The Satanist points out that any ornamentation of the scoffer's body shows that he too is guilty of pride, regardless of how verbose the cynic may be in his intellectual description of how free he is still wearing the elements of pride. Being reluctant to get up in the morning is to be guilty of sloth. If you have been long enough, you may find yourself committing yet another sin, lust. To have the faintest stirring of sexual desire is to be guilty of lust. In order to ensure the propagation of humanity, nature made lust the second most powerful instinct, the first being self-preservation. Realizing this, the Christian Church made fornication the original sin. In this way, by nature, no one would escape sin. Their very state of being is as a result of sin, the original sin. The strongest impulse in every living thing is self-preservation, which brings us to the last of the 7 deadly sins, anger. Is it not our instinct for self-preservation that is aroused when someone harms us, when we become angry enough to protect ourselves from further attack? A Satanist practice the motto, if a man smite thee on one cheek, smash him on the other, let no wrong go unredressed. Be as a lion in the path, be dangerous even in defeat. Since man's natural instincts lead him to sin, all men are sinners and all sinners go to hell. If everyone goes to hell, then you will meet all your friends there. Heaven must be populated with some rather strange creatures if all they lived for was to go to a place where they can strum harps for eternity. Times have changed. Religious leaders no longer preach that all our natural actions are sinful. We no longer think sex is dirty, or that taking pride in ourselves is shameful, or that wanting something someone else has is vicious. Of course not. Times have changed. If you want proof of this, just look at how liberal churches have become. Why, they're practicing all the things they preach. Satanists hear these and similar statements all the time, and they agree wholeheartedly. But if the world has changed so much, why continue to grasp at the threads of a dying faith? If many religions are denying their own scriptures because they are out of date and are preaching the philosophies of Satanism, why not call it by its rightful name, Satanism? Certainly it would be far less appropriate. In recent years, there has been an attempt to humanize the spiritual concept of Christianity. This has manifested itself in the most obvious non-spiritual means. Masses, which have been said in Latin, are now said in the native languages, which only succeeds in making the nonsense easier to understand, and at the same time robs the ceremony of the esoteric nature which is consistent with the tenets of the dogma. It is much simpler to obtain an emotional reaction using words and phrases that cannot be understood than it is with statements which even the simplest mind will question when hearing them in an understandable language. If priests and ministers were to have used the devices to fill their churches 100 years ago that they use today, they would have been charged with heresy, called devils, oftentimes persecuted, but certainly excommunicated without hesitation. Religionists wail, we must keep up with the times, forgetting that due to limiting factors and deeply ingrained laws of white light religions, there can never be sufficient change to meet the needs of man, as religions have always represented the spiritual nature of man, with little or no concern for his carnal or mundane needs. They have considered this life but transitory, flesh merely a shell, physical pleasure trivial, and pain a worthwhile preparation for the kingdom of God. How well the utter hypocrisy comes forth when the righteous make a change in their religion to keep up with man's natural change. The only way that Christianity can ever completely serve the needs of man is to become as Satanism is now. It has become necessary for a new religion based on man's natural instincts to come forth. They have named it. It is called Satanism. astronomy, etc. When one name is no longer appropriate for a given thing, it is only logical to change it to another which benefits the subject. Why then do we not follow suit in the area of religion? Why continue to call a religion the same name when the tenets of that religion no longer fit the original one? Or if religion does preach the same things that it always has, but its followers practice nearly none of its teachings, why do they continue to call themselves by the name given to the followers of that religion? If you do not believe in what your religion teaches, why continue to support a belief which is contradictory with your feelings? You would never vote for a person or issue you do not believe in, so why cast your ecclesiastical vote for a religion which is not consistent with your convictions? You have no right to complain about a political situation you have voted for anyway, which includes sitting back and complacently agreeing with neighbors who approve the situation just because you are too lazy or cowardly to speak your mind. So it is with religious balloting. Even if you cannot be aggressively honest about your opinions because of unfavorable consequences from employers, community leaders, etc., you can at least be honest with yourself. In the privacy of your own home and with close friends, you must support religion which has your best interests at heart. Satanism is based on a very simple philosophy, say the answer. But why call it Satanism? Why not call it something like humanism, or a name that would have the connotation of a witchcraft group, something a little more esoteric, something less blatant? There is more than one reason for this. Humanism is not a religion, it is simply a way of life, not a ceremony or dogma. Satanism has both ceremony and dogma. Dogma, as will be explained, is necessary. Satanism differs greatly from all other so-called white witchcraft groups in the world today. These self-righteous and supercilious religions protest that their members use the powers of magic only for altruistic purposes. Satanists look with disdain upon white witchcraft groups because they feel that altruism is sinning in the layaway plan. It is unnatural not to have the desire to gain things for yourself. Satanism represents a form of controlled selfishness. This does not mean that you never do anything for anyone else. If you do something to make someone you care happy, this happiness will give you a sense of gratification. Satanism advocates practicing a modified form of law. Our interpretation of this rule is do unto others as they do unto you. Because if you do unto others as you would have them do unto you, if they enter and treat you badly, it goes against human nature to continue to treat them with consideration. You should do unto others as you would have them do unto you, but if your courtesy is not returned, they should be treated with the wrath they deserve. White witchcraft groups say that if you curse a person, it will return to you threefold, coming in jewels to handsomely boomerang back to the sender. This is yet another indication of the guilt-ridden philosophy which is held by these neo-pagan pseudo-Christian groups. White witches want to delve into witchcraft but cannot divorce themselves from the stigma attached to it. Therefore, they call themselves white magicians and base 75% of their philosophy on the trite and hackneyed tenets of Christianity. Anyone who pretends to be interested in magic or the occult for reasons other than gaining personal power is the worst kind of hypocrite. The Satanist respects Christianity for at least being consistent in its guilt-ridden philosophy, but can only feel contempt for people who attempt to appear emancipated from guilt by joining a witchcraft group and practice the same basic philosophy as Christianity. White magic is supposedly utilized only for good or unselfish purposes, and black magic, we are told, is used for only selfish or evil reasons. Satanism draws no such dividing line. Magic is magic, but it is used to help or hinder. The Satanist, being the magician, should have the ability to decide what is just and then apply the powers of magic to attain his goals. During white magical ceremonies, the practitioners stand within a pentagram to protect themselves from the evil forces as they call upon for help. To the Satanist, it seems a bit two-faced to call on these forces for help, while at the same time protecting yourself from the very powers you have asked for assistance. The Satanist realizes that only by putting himself in league with these forces can he fully and unhypocritically utilize the powers of darkness to his best advantage. In a satanic magical ceremony that the participants do not join hands and dance, ring around the rosy in a circle, burn candles of various colors for various wishes, call out the names of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, while supposedly practicing black arts, pick a saint for their personal guide in obtaining help for their problems, dunk themselves in swimming pools, because this is not the way to practice satanic magic. If you cannot divorce yourself from hypocritical self-deceit, you will never be successful as a magician, much less a Satanist. The satanic religion has not merely lifted the coin, it has flipped it completely over. Therefore, why should it support the very principles to which it is completely opposed by calling itself anything other than a name which is totally in keeping with the reversed doctrines which make up the satanic philosophy? Satanism is not a white religion. It is a religion of the flesh, the mundane, the carnal, all of which are ruled by Satan, the personification of the left-hand path. Inevitably, the next question asked is, granted you can't call it humanism because humanism is not a religion, but why even have a religion in the first place if all you do is what comes naturally anyway? Why not just do it? Modern man has come a long way. He has become disenchanted with the nonsensical dogmas of past religions. We are living in an enlightened age. Psychiatry has made great strides in enlightening man about his true personality. We are living in an era of intellectual awareness unlike any the world has ever seen. This is all very well and good, but there is one flaw in this new state of awareness. It is one thing to accept something intellectually, but to accept the same thing emotionally is an entirely different matter. The one need that psychiatry cannot fill is man's inherent need for emotionalizing or dogma. Man needs ceremony and ritual, fantasy and enchantment. Psychiatry, despite all the good it has done, has robbed man of wonder and fantasy which religion in the past has provided. Satanism, realizing the current needs of man, fills the large gray void between religion and psychiatry. The satanic philosophy combines the fundamentals of psychology and good honest emotionalizing or dogma. It provides man with his much needed fantasy. There is nothing wrong with dogma, providing it is not based on ideas and actions which go completely against human nature. The quickest way of traveling between 2 points is in a straight line. If all the guilts that have been built up can be turned into advantages, it eliminates the need for intellectual purging of the psyche in an attempt to cleanse it from its repressions. Satanism is the only religion known to man that accepts man as he is and promotes the rationale of turning a bad thing into a good thing rather than bending over backwards to eliminate the bad. Therefore, after intellectually evaluating the problems through common sense and drawing on what psychiatry has taught us, if you still cannot emotionally release yourself from unwarranted guilt and put your theories into action, then you should learn to make your guilt work for you. You should act upon your natural instincts, and then if you cannot perform without feeling guilty, revel in your guilt. This may sound like a contradiction in terms, but if you will think about it, guilt can often add fuel to the senses. Adults would do well to take a lesson from children. Children often take great delight in doing something they know they are not supposed to. Yes, times have changed, but man hasn't. The basics of Satanism have always existed. The only thing that is new is the formal organization of the religion, based on the universal traits of man. For centuries, magnificent structures of stone, concrete, mortar, and steel have been devoted to man's abstinence. It is high time that human beings stopped fighting themselves and devoted their time to building temples designed for man's indulgences. Even though times have changed and always will, man remains basically the same. For 2,000 years, man has done penance for something he never should have had to feel guilty about in the first place. We are tired of denying ourselves the pleasures of life which we deserve. Today, as always, man needs to enjoy himself here and now instead of waiting for his rewards in heaven. So why not have a religion based on indulgence? Certainly it is consistent with the nature of the beast. We are no longer supplicating weaklings trembling before an unmerciful God who cares not whether we live or die. We are self-respecting, prideful people. We are Satanists. Hell, the devil, and how to sell your soul. Satan has certainly been the best friend the church has ever had, as he has kept it in business all these years. The false doctrine of hell and the devil has allowed the Protestant and Catholic churches to flourish far too long. Without a devil to point their fingers at, religionists of the right-hand path would have nothing with which to threaten their followers. Satan leads you to temptation. Satan is the prince of evil. Satan is vicious, cruel, brutal, therefore. If you give in to the temptations of the devil, you will surely suffer eternal damnation and roast in hell. represents the carnal, earthly, and mundane aspects of life. Satan, the chief devil of the Western world, was originally an angel whose duty was to report human delinquencies to God. It was not until the 14th century that he began to be depicted as an evil deity who was part man and part animal, with goat-like horns and hooves. Before Christianity gave him the names of Satan, Lucifer, etc., the carnal side of man's nature was governed by the god which was then called Dionysus or Pan, depicted as a satyr or faun. Pan was originally the good guy and symbolized fertility and fecundity. Whenever a nation comes under a new form of government, the heroes of the past become villains of the present. So it is with religion. The earliest Christians believed that the pagan deities were devils and to employ them was to use black magic. Miraculous heavenly events they termed white magic. This was the sole distinction between the two. The old gods did not die. They fell into hell and became devils. The bogey, goblin, or bugaboo used to frighten children is derived from the Slavonic bog, which means God, as does bago in Hindu. The pleasures revered before the advent of Christianity were condemned by the new religion. It required little changeover to transform the horns and cloven hooves of Pan into the most convincing devil. Pan's attributes could be neatly changed into charged with punishment sins, and so the metamorphosis was complete. The association of the goat with the devil is found in the Christian Bible, where the holiest day of the year, the Day of Atonement, was celebrated by casting lots for two goats, without blemish, one to be offered to the Lord and one to Azazel. The goat carrying the sins of the people was driven into the desert and became a scapegoat. This is the origin of the goat, which is still used in lodge ceremonies today, as it was also used in Egypt, where once a year it was sacrificed to a god. The devils of mankind are many, and their origins diversified. The performance of satanic ritual does not embrace the calling forth of demons. This practice is followed only by those who are in fear of the very forces they conjure. Supposedly, demons are malevolent spirits with attributes conductive to the deterioration of the people or events that they touch upon. The Greek word demon meant a guardian spirit or source of inspiration, and to be sure, later theologians invented legion upon legion of these harbingers of inspiration, all wicked. An indication of the cowardice of magicians of the right-hand path is the practice of calling upon a particular demon, who would supposedly be a minion of the devil, to do his bidding. The assumption is that the demon, being only a form of the devil, is easier to control. Occult lore states that only the most formidably protected or insanely foolhardy sorcerer would try to call forth the devil himself. The Satanist does not furtively call upon these lesser devils, but brazenly invokes those who people the infernal army of long-standing outrage, the devils themselves. Theologians have cataloged some of the names of devils in their list of demons, as might be expected, but the roster which follows contains the names and origins of the gods and goddesses called upon, which make up a large part of the occupancy of the royal palace of hell, the four crown princes of hell. Satan, Hebrew, adversary, opposite, accuser, lord of fire, the infernal, the south. Lucifer, Roman, bringer of light, enlightenment, the air, the morning star, the east. Belial, Hebrew, without a master, baseness of the earth, independence, the north. Leviathan, Hebrew, the serpent out of the deeps, the sea, the west. The infernal names: Abaddon, Hebrew, the destroyer; Adramelech, Sumerian devil; Abuk, Mayan devil; Arba, son of Loki, depicted as a wolf. Gorgo, Demogorgon, Greek name of the devil. Hammurabi, Hebrew synonym for Satan. Hekate, Greek goddess of the underworld and witchcraft. Ishtar, Babylonian goddess of fertility. Kali, Hindu, daughter of Shiva, high priestess of Hades. Lilith, Hebrew female devil, Adam's first wife who taught him the ropes. Loki, Teutonic devil. Mammon, Aramaic god of wealth and profit. Manaya, Etruscan goddess of hell. Mantis, Etruscan god of hell. Marduk, god of the city of Babylon. Mastema, Hebrew synonym for Satan. Melantos, Yazidi devil. Mephistopheles, Greek, he who shuns the light, QV, Faust. Metzli, Aztec goddess of the night. Micthian, Aztec god of death. Midgard, son of Loki, depicted as a serpent. Milcom, Ammonite devil. Moloch, Phoenician and Canaanite devil. Mormon, Greek, king of the ghouls, consort of Hekate. Nama, Hebrew female devil of seduction. Nergal, Babylonian god of Hades. Nahasa, American Indian devil. Nija, Polish god of the underworld. Oyama, Japanese name for Satan. Pan, Greek god of lust, later relegated to deviltom. Buddha, Greek god of the underworld. Proserpine, Greek queen of the underworld. Clarka, Welsh name for Satan. Rimmon, Syrian devil worshipped at Damascus. Sabazios, Phrygian origin, identified with Dionysus, snake worship. Satan, Enochian equivalent of Satan. Samael, Hebrew, venom of God. Samuel, Central Asian devil. Sedet, American Indian devil. Sekhmet, Egyptian goddess of vengeance. Set, Egyptian devil. Shaitan, Arabic name for Satan. Shiva, Hindu, the destroyer. Supe, Inca god of the underworld. Teanmo, Chinese counterpart to the devil. Covetousness, desire. Trot, Russian name for Satan, black god. Tezcatlipoca, Aztec god of hell. Tammuz, Sumerian god who later was relegated to devildom. Thoth, Egyptian god of magic. Junrita, Scandinavian female devil. Typhon, Greek personification of Satan. Yangtze, Aztec god of hell. Yanloe, Chinese ruler of hell. The devils of past religions have always, at least in part, had animal characteristics, evidence of man's constant need to deny his nature as an animal, for to do so would serve a mighty blow to his impoverished ego. The pig was despised by the Jews and the Egyptians. It symbolized the gods Frey, Osiris, Adonis, Persephone, Attis, and Demeter, and was sacrificed to Osiris and the moon. But in time, it became degraded into a devil. The Phoenicians worshipped the fly god, Baal, from which comes the devil, Beelzebub. Both Baal and Beelzebub are identical to the dung beetle or scarabaeus of the Egyptians, which appeared to resurrect itself much as the mythical bird, the phoenix, rose from its own ashes. The ancient Jews believed, through their contact with the Persians, that the two great forces in the world were Ahura Mazda, the god of fire, light, life, and goodness, and Ahriman, the serpent, the god of darkness, destruction, death, and evil. These and countless other examples not only depict man's devils as animals, but also show his need to sacrifice the original animal gods and demote them to his devils. At the time of the Reformation, in the 16th century, the alchemist Dr. Johann Faustus discovered a method of summoning a demon, Mephistopheles, from hell, and making a pact with him. He signed a contract in blood to turn his soul over to Mephistopheles, in return for the feeling of youth, and at once became young. When the time came for Faustus to die, he retired to his room and was blown to bits as though his laboratory had exploded. This story is a protest of the times, the 16th century, against science, chemistry, and magic. To the Satanists, it is unnecessary to sell your soul to the devil or make a pact with Satan. This threat was devised by Christianity to terrorize people so they would not stray from the fold. With scolding fingers and trembling voices, they taught their followers that if they gave in to the temptation of Satan and lived their lives according to their natural predilections, they would have to pay for their sinful pleasures by giving their souls to Satan and suffering in hell for all eternity. People were led to believe that a pure soul was a passport to everlasting life. Pious prophets have taught man to fear Satan, but what of terms like God-fearing? If God is so merciful, why do people have to fear him? Are we to believe there is was a valley near Jerusalem where Moloch reigned and garbage was dumped and burned. It is from this that the Christian church has evolved the idea of fire and brimstone in hell. The Protestant hell and the Catholic hell are places of eternal punishment. However, the Catholics also believe there is a purgatory where all souls go for a time, and the limbo where unbaptized souls go. The Buddhist hell is divided into 8 sections, the first of 7, which can be expiated. The ecclesiastical description of hell is that of a horrible place of fire and torment. In Dante's Inferno and in northern climes, it was thought to be an icy cold region, a giant refrigerator. Even with all their threats of eternal damnation and soul roasting, Christian missionaries have run across some of them who are not so quick to swallow their drivel. Pleasure and pain, like beauty, are in the eye of the beholder. So when missionaries ventured into Alaska and warned the Eskimos of the horrors of hell and the blazing lake of fire awaiting transgressors, they eagerly asked, how do we get there? Most Satanists do not accept Satan as an anthropomorphic being with cloven hooves, a barbed tail, and horns. He merely represents a force in nature, the powers of darkness which have been named just that because no religion has taken these forces out of darkness, nor has science been able to apply technical terminology to this force. It is an untapped reservoir that few can make use of because they lack the ability to use a tool without having to first break down and label all the parts of it can run. It is this incessant need to analyze which prohibits most people from taking advantage of this many-faceted key to the unknown, which the Satanist chooses to call Satan. Satan as a god, demigod, personal savior, or whatever you wish to call him, was invented by the formulators of every religion on the face of the earth for only one purpose, to preside over man's so-called wicked activities and situations here on earth. Consequently, anything resulting in physical or mental gratification was defined as evil, thus assuring a lifetime of unwarranted guilt for everyone. So if evil, they have named us evil we are, and so what? The satanic age is upon us, why not take advantage of it and live? Love and hate. Satanism represents kindness to those who deserve it instead of love wasted on ingrates. You cannot love everyone. It is ridiculous to think you can. If you love everyone and everything, you lose your natural powers of selection and wind up being a pretty poor judge of character and quality. If anything is used too freely, it loses its true meaning. Therefore, the Satanist believes you should love strongly and completely those who deserve your love, but never turn the other cheek to your enemy. Love is one of the most intense emotions felt by man. Another is hate. Forcing yourself to feel indiscriminate love is very unnatural. If you try to love everyone, you only lessen your feelings for those who deserve your love. Repressed hatred can lead to many physical and emotional ailments. By learning to release your hatred towards those who deserve it, you cleanse yourself of these malignant emotions and do not take your pretended hatred out on your loved ones. There has never been a great love movement in the history of the world that hasn't wound up killing countless numbers of people, we must assume, to prove how much they love them. Every hypocrite who ever walked the earth has had pockets bulging with love. Every pharisaical religionist claims to love his enemies, even though when wronged he consoles himself by thinking God will punish them. Instead of admitting to themselves that they are capable of hating their foes and treating them in the manner they deserve, they say, "There, but for the grace of God I go," and pray for them. Why should we humiliate and lower ourselves by drawing such inaccurate comparisons? Satanism has been thought of as being synonymous with cruelty and brutality. This is so only because people are afraid to face the truth, and the truth is that human beings are not all benign or all loving. Just because the Satanist admits he is capable of both love and hate, he is considered hateful. On the contrary, because he is able to give vent to his hatred through ritualized expression, he is far more capable of love, the deepest kind of love. By honestly recognizing and admitting to both the hate and the love he feels, there is no confusing one emotion with the other. Without being able to experience one of these emotions, you cannot fully experience the other. Satanic sex. Much controversy has arisen over the satanic views of free love. It is often assumed that sexual activity is the most important factor of the satanic religion, and that willingness to participate in sex orgies is prerequisite for becoming a Satanist. Nothing could be farther from the truth. In fact, opportunists who have no deeper interest in Satanism than merely the sexual aspects are emphatically discouraged. Satanism does advocate sexual freedom, but only in the true sense of the word. Free love in the satanic concept means exactly that. Freedom to either be faithful to one person or to indulge your sexual desires with as many others as you feel is necessary to satisfy your particular needs. Satanism does not encourage orgiastic activity or extramarital affairs for those to whom they do not come naturally. For many, it would be very unnatural and detrimental to be unfaithful to their chosen mates. To others, it would be frustrating to be bound sexually to just one person. Each person must decide for himself what form of sexual activity best suits his individual needs. Self-deceitfully forcing yourself to be adulterous or to have sex partners when not married just for the sake of proving others, or worse yet, to yourself, that you are emancipated from sexual guilt is just as wrong by satanic standards as leaving any sexual need unfulfilled because of ingrained feelings of guilt. Many of those who are constantly preoccupied with demonstrating their emancipation from sexual guilt are in reality held in even greater sexual bondage than those who simply accept sexual activity as a natural part of life and don't make a big to-do over their sexual freedom. For example, it is an established fact that Nymphomaniac, every man's dream girl and heroine of all lurid novels, is not sexually free, but is actually frigid and roves from man to man because she is too inhibited to ever find complete sexual release. Another misconception is the idea that the ability to engage in group sexual activity is indicative of sexual freedom. All contemporary free sex groups have one thing in common: discouragement of fetishistic or deviant activity. Actually, the most forced examples of non-fetishistic sexual activity, thinly disguised as freedom, have a common format. Each of the participants in the orgy removes all clothing, following the example set forth by one, and mechanically fornicate, also following the leader's example. None of the performers consider that their emancipated form of sex might be regarded as regimented and infantile by non-members who fail to equate uniformity with freedom. The Satanist realizes that if he is to be a sexual connoisseur and truly free from all sexual guilt, he cannot be stifled by the so-called sexual revolutionists any more than he can by the prudery of his guilt-ridden society. These free sex clubs miss the whole point of sexual freedom. Unless sexual activity can be expressed on an individual basis, which includes personal fetishes, there is absolutely no purpose in belonging to a sexual freedom organization. Satanism condones any type of sexual activity which properly satisfies your individual desires, be it heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, or even asexual if you choose. Satanism also sanctions any fetish or deviation which will enhance your sex life, so long as it involves no one who does not wish to be involved. The prevalence of deviant and or fetishistic behavior in our society would stagger the imagination of the sexual naive. There are more sexual variants than the unenlightened individual can perceive. Transvestism, sadism, masochism, uromania, exhibitionism, to name only a few of the more predominant. Everyone has some form of fetish, but because they are unaware of the preponderance of fetishistic activity in our society, they feel they are depraved if they submit to their unnatural yearnings. Even the asexual has a deviation: his asexuality. It is far more abnormal to have a lack of sexual desire unless illness or old age or another valid reason has caused it, than it is to be sexually promiscuous. However, if a Satanist chooses sexual sublimation above overt sexual expression, that is entirely his own affair. In many cases of sexual sublimation or asexuality, any attempt to emancipate himself sexually would prove devastating to the asexual. Asexuals are invariably sexually sublimated by their jobs or hobbies. All the energy and driving interest which would normally be devoted to sexual activity is channeled into other pastimes or into their chosen occupations. If a person favors other interests over sexual activity, it is his right, and no one is justified in condemning him for it. However, the person should at least recognize the fact that this is a sexual sublimation. Because of lack of opportunity for expression, many secret sexual desires never progress beyond the fantasy stage. Lack of release often leads to compulsion, and therefore a great number of people devise undetectable methods of giving vent to their urges. Just because most fetishistic activity is not outwardly apparent, the sexually unsophisticated should not delude himself into thinking it does not exist. To cite examples of the ingenious techniques used, the male transvestite will indulge in his fetish by wearing feminine undergarments while going about his daily activities. Or the masochistic woman might wear a rubber girdle several sizes too small, so she may derive sexual pleasure from her fetishistic discomfort throughout the day, with no one realizing it. These illustrations are far tamer and more prevalent examples than others which could have been given. Satanism encourages any form of sexual expression you may desire, so long as it hurts no one else. This statement must be qualified to avoid misinterpretation. By not hurting another, this does not include the unintentional hurt felt by those who might not agree with your views on sex because of their anxieties regarding sexual morality. Naturally, you should avoid offending others who mean a great deal to you, such as British friends and relatives. However, if you earnestly endeavor to escape hurting them, and despite your efforts they accidentally find out, you cannot be held responsible, and therefore should feel no guilt as a result of either your sexual convictions or their being hurt because of those convictions. If you are in constant fear of offending the British by your attitude towards sex, then there is no sense in trying to emancipate yourself from sexual guilt. However, no purpose is served by flaunting your permissiveness. The other exception to the rule regards dealings with masochists. A masochist derives pleasure from being hurt, so denying the masochist his pleasure through pain hurts him just as much as actual physical pain hurts the masochist. The story of the truly cruel sadist illustrates this point. The masochist says to the sadist, "Beat me," to which the merciless sadist replies, "No." If a person wants to be hurt and enjoy suffering, then there is no reason not to indulge him in his want. The term sadist in popular usage describes one who obtains pleasure from indiscriminate brutality. Actually, though, a true sadist is selective. He carefully chooses from the vast reserve of appropriate victims and takes great delight in giving those who thrive on misery the fulfillment of their desires. The well-adjusted sadist is Epicurean in selecting those on whom his energies will be well spent. If a person is healthy enough to admit he is a masochist and enjoys being enslaved and whipped, the real sadist is glad to oblige. Aside from the foregoing exceptions, the Satanist would not intentionally hurt others by violating their sexual rights. If you attempt to impose your sexual desires upon others who do not welcome your advances, you are infringing upon their sexual freedom. Therefore, Satanism does not advocate rape, child molesting, sexual defilement of animals, or any other form of sexual activity which entails the participation of those who are unwilling or whose innocence or naivety would allow them to be intimidated or misguided into doing something against their wishes. If all parties involved are mature adults who willingly take full responsibility for their actions and voluntarily engage in a given form of sexual expression, even if it is generally considered taboo, then there is no reason for them to repress their sexual inclinations. If you are aware of all the implications, advantages, and disadvantages, and are certain your actions will hurt no one who does not wish or deserve to be hurt, you have no cause to suppress your sexual preferences. Just as no two people are exactly the same in their choice of diet or have the same capacity for the consumption of food, sexual tastes and appetites vary from person to person. No person or society has the right to set limitations on the sexual standards or the frequency of sexual activity of another. Proper sexual conduct can only be judged within the context of each individual situation. Therefore, what one person considers sexually correct or moral may be frustrating to another. The reverse is also true. One person may have great sexual prowess, but it is unjust for him to belittle another whose sexual capacity may not equal his own, and inconsiderate for him to impose himself upon the other person, i.e., the man who has a voracious sexual appetite but whose wife's sexual needs do not match his own. It is unfair for him to expect her to enthusiastically respond to his overtures, but she must display the same degree of thoughtfulness. In the instances when she does not feel great passion, she should either passively but pleasantly accept him sexually or raise no complaint if he chooses to find his needed release elsewhere, including that derive from association with someone you deeply love if you are sexually well suited. If we're not suited to one another sexually, though, it must be stressed that the lack of sexual compatibility does not indicate lack of spiritual love. One can, and often does, exist without the other. As a matter of fact, often one member of a couple will resort to outside sexual activity because he deeply loves his mate and wishes to inflict burden or imposing upon his loved one. Deep spiritual love is enriched by sexual love, and it is certainly a necessary ingredient for any satisfactory relationship. But because of differing sexual predilections, outside sexual activity or masturbation sometimes provides a needed supplement. Masturbation, considered a sexual taboo by many people, creates a guilt problem not easily dealt with. Much emphasis must be placed on this subject, as it constitutes an extremely important ingredient of many a successful magical working. Ever since the Judeo-Christian Bible described the sin of Onan, Genesis 38:7-10, man has considered the seriousness and consequences of the solitary vice. Even though modern sexologists have explained the sin of Onan as simply coitus interruptus, the damage has been done through centuries of theological misinterpretation. Aside from actual sex crimes, masturbation is one of the most frowned upon sexual acts. During the last century, innumerable texts were written describing the horrific consequences of masturbation. Practically all physical or mental illnesses were attributed to the evils of masturbation. Power of the complexion, shortness of breath, furtive expression, sunken chest, nervousness, pimples, and loss of appetite are only a few of the many characteristics supposedly resulting from masturbation. Total physical and mental collapse is assured if one did not heed the warnings in those evils for young men. The lurid descriptions in such texts would be almost humorous were it not for the unhappy fact that even though contemporary sexologists, doctors, writers, etc. have done much to remove the stigma of masturbation, the deep-seated guilt induced by the nonsense in those sexual primers have been partially erased. A large percentage of people, especially those over 40, cannot emotionally accept the fact that masturbation is natural and healthy, even if they now accept it intellectually, and they, in turn, relate their repugnance often subconsciously to their children. It was thought that one would go insane if, despite numerous admonitions, his autoerotic practices persisted. This preposterous myth grew from reports of widespread masturbation by the inmates of mental institutions. It was assumed that since almost all incurably insane people masturbated, it was their masturbation that had driven them mad. No one ever stopped to consider the lack of sexual partners of the opposite sex and the freedom of inhibition, which is characteristic of extreme insanity, were the real reasons for the masturbatory practices of the insane. Many people would rather have their mates seek outside sexual activity than perform autoerotic acts because of their own guilt feelings, the mate's repugnance towards having them engage in masturbation, or the fear of their mate's repugnance. Although in a surprising number of cases, a vicarious thrill is obtained from the knowledge that the mate is having sexual experiences with outsiders, although this is seldom admitted. If stimulation is provided by envisioning one's mate sexually engaged with others, it should be brought out into the open while both parties may gain from such activities. However, if the prohibition of masturbation is only due to the guilt feelings on the part of one or both parties, they should make every attempt to erase those guilts or humanize them. Many relationships might be saved from destruction if the people involved did not feel guilt about performing the natural act of masturbation. Masturbation is regarded as evil because it produces pleasure derived from intentionally fondling a forbidden area of the body by one's own hand. The guilt feelings accompanying most sexual acts can be assuaged by the religiously acceptable contention that your sensual delights are necessary to produce offspring. Even though you cautiously watch the calendar for the safe days, you cannot, however, placate yourself with this rationale while engaging in masturbatory practices. No matter what you've been told about the immaculate conception, even if blind faith allows you to swallow this absurdity, you know full well if you were to produce a child, there must be sexual contact with the person of sex. Therefore, guilt in the original sin will certainly remove even deeper guilt from performing a sex act only for self-gratification, with no intention of creating children. The Satanist fully realizes why religion is declared masturbation to be sin. Like all other natural acts people will do, no matter how severely reprimanded. Causing guilt is an important facet of their malicious scheme to rob the instead of concern for psychic vampires. Many people who walk the earth practice the fine art of making others feel responsible and even indebted to them without cause. Satanism observes these things in their true light. Psychic vampires are individuals who drain others of their vital energy. This type of person can be found in all avenues of society. They fill no useful purpose in our lives and are neither love objects nor true friends. Yet we feel responsible to the psychic vampire without knowing why. If you think you may be the victim of such a person, there are a few simple rules which will help you form a decision. Is there a person you often call or visit even though you really don't want to because you know you will feel guilty if you don't? Or do you find yourself constantly doing favors for one who doesn't come forward and ask, but hints? Often the psychic vampire will use reverse psychology saying, "Oh, I couldn't ask you to do that," and you in turn insist upon doing it. The psychic vampire never demands anything of you. That would be far too presumptuous. They simply let their wishes be known in subtle ways which will prevent them from being considered pests. They wouldn't think of imposing, and are always content and willingly accept their lot without the slightest outward. Their sins are not of commission but of omission. It's what they don't say, not what they do say, that makes you feel you must account to them. They are much too crafty to make overt demands upon you, because they know you would resent it and would have a tangible and legitimate reason for denying them. A large percentage of these people have special attributes which make their dependence upon you more feasible and much more effective. Many psychic vampires are influenced or pretend to be, or are mentally or emotionally disturbed. Others might feign ignorance or incompetence so you will, out of pity, or more often exasperation, do things for them. The traditional way to banish a demon or elemental is to recognize it for what it is and exorcise it. Recognition of these modern-day demons and their methods is the only antidote for their devastating hold. Most people accept these passively vicious individuals at face value only because their insidious maneuvers have never been pointed out to them. They merely accept these poor souls as being less fortunate than themselves and feel they must help them however they can. It is this misdirected sense of responsibility or unfounded sense of guilt which nourishes well the altruisms upon which these parasites feast. The psychic vampire is allowed to exist because he cleverly chooses conscientious, responsible people for his victims, people with great dedication to their moral obligations. In some cases, we are vampirized for groups of people as well as individuals. Every fundraising organization, be it a charitable foundation, community council, religious or fraternal association, etc., carefully selects a person who is adept at making others feel guilty for its chairman or coordinator. It is the job of this chairman to intimidate us into opening first our hearts and then our wallets to the recipient of their goodwill, never mentioning that, in many cases, their time is not unselfishly donated, but that they are drawing a fat salary for their noble deeds. They are masters at playing upon the sympathy and consideration of responsible people. How often we see little children who have been sent forth by these self-righteous vegans to painlessly extract donations from the kindly. Who can resist the innocent charm of a child? There are, of course, people who are not happy unless they are giving, but many of us do not fit into this category. Unfortunately, we are often put upon to do things we do not genuinely feel should be required of us. A conscientious person finds it very difficult to decide between voluntary and imposed charity. He wants to do what is right and just and finds it perplexing trying to decide exactly who he should help and what degree of aid should rightfully be expected of him. Each person must decide for himself what his obligations are to his respective friends, family, and community. Before donating his time and money to those outside his immediate family and close circle of friends, he must decide what he can afford without depriving those closest to him. When taking these things into consideration, he must be certain to include himself among those who are close to him. He must carefully evaluate the validity of the request and the personality or motives of the person asking it of him. It is extremely difficult for a person to learn to say no when all his life he has said yes. But unless he wants to be constantly taken advantage of, he must learn to say no when circumstances justify doing so. If If you allow them, psychic vampires will gradually infiltrate your everyday life until you have no privacy left, and your constant feeling of concern for them will deplete you of all ambition. A psychic vampire will always select a person who is relatively content and satisfied with his life, a person who is happily married, pleased with his job, and generally well adjusted to the world around him to feed upon. The very fact that the psychic vampire chooses to victimize a happy person shows that he is lacking all the things his victim has. He will do everything he can to stir up trouble and disharmony between his victim and those people he holds dear. Therefore, be wary of anyone who seems to have no real friends and no apparent interest in life except you. He will usually tell you he is very selective in his choice of friends, or doesn't make friends easily because of the high standards he sets for his companions. To acquire and keep friends, one must be willing to give of himself, something of which the psychic vampire is incapable. But he will hasten to add that you fulfill every requirement and are truly an outstanding exception among men. You are one of the very few worthy of his friendship. Lest you confuse desperate love, which is a very selfish thing, with psychic vampirism. The vast difference between the two must be clarified. The only way to determine if you are being vampirized is to weigh what you give the person compared to what they give you in return. You may, at times, become annoyed with the obligations put upon you by a loved one, a close friend, or even an employer. But before you label them psychic vampires, you must ask yourself, what am I getting in return? If your spouse or lover insists that you call them frequently, but you also require them to account to you for their time spent away from you, you must realize this is a give-and-take situation. Or if a friend is in the habit of calling upon you for help at inopportune moments, but you similarly depend upon them to give your immediate needs priority, you must regard it as a fair exchange. If your employer asks you to do a little more than is normally expected of you in your particular position, but will overlook occasional tardiness or will give you time off when you need it, you certainly have no cause for complaint and need not feel he is taking advantage of you. You are, however, being vampirized if you are incessantly called upon or expected to do favors for someone who, when you need a favor, always happens to have other pressing obligations. Many psychic vampires will give you material things for the express purpose of making you feel you owe them something in return, thereby binding you to them. The difference between your giving and theirs is that your return payment must come in a non-material form. They want you to feel obligated to them and would be very disappointed and even resentful if you attempted to repay them with material objects. In essence, you have sold your soul to them, and they'll constantly remind you of your duty to them by not reminding you. Being purely satanic, the only way to deal with a psychic vampire is to play dumb and act as though they are genuinely altruistic and really expect nothing in return. Teach them a lesson by graciously taking what they give you, thanking them loudly enough for all to hear, and walking away. In this way, you come out the victor. What can they say? And when you are inevitably expected to repay their generosity, this is the hard part, you say no. But again, graciously. When they feel you falling from their clutches, two things will happen. First, they will act crushed, hoping your old feeling of duty and sympathy will return. And when, and if it doesn't, they will show their true colors and will become angry and vindictive. Once you have moved them to this point, you can play the role of the injured party. After all, you've done nothing wrong. You just happen to have had pressing obligations when they needed you. And since nothing was expected in return for their gifts, there should be no hard feelings. Generally, the psychic vampire will realize his methods have been discovered and will not press the issue. He will not continue to waste his time with you, but will move on to his next unsuspecting victim. There are times, however, when the psychic vampire will not release his hold so easily and will do everything possible to torment you. They have plenty of time for this because when one is rejected, they will neglect all else, what little else they have, that is, to devote their every waking moment to planning the revenge to which they feel they are entitled. For this reason, it is best to avoid a relationship with this kind of person in the first place. Their adulation and dependence upon you may at first be very flattering and their material gifts very attractive, but you will eventually find yourself paying for them many times over. Don't waste your time with people who will ultimately destroy you, but concentrate instead on those who will appreciate your responsibility to them and likewise feel responsible to you. And if you are a psychic vampire, take heed, beware of the Satanist. He is ready and willing to gleefully drive the proverbial stake through your heart. Indulgence. desires. Only by doing so can you be a completely satisfied person with no frustrations, which can be harmful to yourself and others around you. Therefore, the most simplified description of the Satanic belief is indulgence instead of abstinence. People often mistake compulsion for indulgence, but there is a world of difference between the two. A compulsion is never created by indulging, but by not being able to indulge. By making something taboo, it only serves to intensify the desire. Everyone likes to do the things they have been told not to. Forbidden fruits are sweetest. Webster's Encyclopedic Dictionary defines indulgence thusly: to give oneself up to, not to restrain or oppose, to give free course to gratify by compliance, to yield to. The dictionary definition of compulsion is the act of compelling or driving by a force, physical or mental, constraint of the will, compulsory, obligatory. In other words, indulgence implies choice, whereas compulsion indicates the lack of choice. When a person has no proper release for his desires, they rapidly build up and become compulsions. If everyone had a particular time and place for the purpose of periodically indulging in their personal desires without fear of embarrassment or reproach, they would be sufficiently released to lead unfrustrated lives in the everyday world. They would be free to plunge headlong into whatever undertaking they might choose instead of going about their duties half-heartedly, their creative urges frustrated by denying their natural desires. This would apply in the majority of cases, but there will always be those who work better under pressure. Generally, those who need to endure a certain amount of hardship to produce to their full capabilities are in basically artistic vocations, more will be said later about fulfillment through self-denial. This does not mean to imply that all artists fit into this category. On the contrary, many artists are unable to produce unless their basic animal needs have been satisfied. For the most part, it is not the artist or individualist, but the average middle-class working man or woman who is lacking the proper release for their desires. It is ironic that the responsible, respectable person, the one who pays society's bills, should be the one given the least in return. It is he who must be ever conscious of his moral obligations and who is condemned for normally indulging in his natural desires. The Satanic religion considers this a gross injustice. He who upholds his responsibility should be most entitled to the pleasures of his choice, without censure from the society he serves. Finally, a religion, Satanism, has been formed which commends and rewards those who support the society in which they live, instead of denouncing them for their human needs. From every set of principles, be it religious, political, or philosophical, some good can be extracted. Amidst the madness of the Hitlerian concept, one point stands out as a shining example of this: strength through joy. Hitler was no fool when he offered the German people happiness on a personal level to ensure their loyalty to him and peak efficiency from them. It has been clearly established that the majority of all illnesses are of a psychosomatic nature, and that psychosomatic illnesses are a direct result of frustration. It has been said that the good die young. The good, by Christian standards, do die young. It is the frustration of our natural instincts which leads to the deterioration of our minds and bodies. It has become very fashionable to concentrate on the betterment of the mind and spirit, and to consider giving pleasure to one's body, the very shell without which the mind and spirit could not exist, to be coarse, crude, unrefined. As of late, most people who deem themselves emancipated have left normalcy only to transcend into idiocy. By way of bending their behinds around to meet their navels, subsisting on wild and exotic diets like brown rice and tea, they feel they will arrive at a great state of spiritual development. Hogwash, says the Satanist. He would rather eat a good hearty meal, exercise his imagination, and transcend by means of physical and emotional fulfillment. It seems to the Satanist that after being harnessed with unreasonable religious demands for so many centuries, one would welcome the chance to be human for once. If anyone thinks that by denying his natural desires he can avoid mediocrity, he should examine the Eastern mystical beliefs which have been in great intellectual favor in recent years. Christianity is old hat, so those who wish to escape its fetters have turned to so-called enlightened religions such as Buddhism. Although Christianity is certainly deserving of the criticism it has received, perhaps it has been taking more than its share of the blame. The followers of the mystical beliefs are every bit as guilty of the little humanisms as the misguided Christians. Both religions are based on trite philosophies, but the mystical religionists profess to be enlightened and emancipated emancipated from the guilt-ridden dogma which is typified by Christianity. However, the Eastern mystic is even more preoccupied than the Christian with avoiding animalistic actions that remind him that he is not a saint, but merely a man, only another form of animal. Sometimes better, more often worse than those who walk on all fours, and who, because of his divine spiritual and intellectual development, has become the most vicious animal of all. The Satanists ask, what is wrong with being human and having human limitations as well as assets? By denying his desires, the mystic has come no closer to overcoming compulsion than his kindred soul, the Christian. The Eastern mystical beliefs have taught people to contemplate their navels, stand on their heads, stare at blank walls, avoid the use of labels in life, and discipline themselves against any desire for materialistic pleasure. Nevertheless, I am sure you have seen just as many so-called disciplined yogis with the inability to control a smoking habit as anyone else, or just as many supposedly emancipated Buddhists become just as excited as a less aware person when they are confronted with a member of the opposite, or in some cases, the same sex. Yet, when asked to explain the reason for their hypocrisy, these people retreat into the ambiguousness which characterizes their faith. No one can pin them down if there are no straight answers that can be given. The simple fact of the matter is that the very thing which has led this type of person to a faith which preaches abstinence is indulgence. Their compulsive masochism is the reason for choosing a religion which not only advocates self-denial but praises them for it and gives them a sacrosanct avenue of expression for the masochistic needs. The more abuse they can stand, the holier they become. Masochism, to most people, represents a rejection of indulgence. Satanism points out many meanings behind the meanings and considers masochism to be an indulgence if any attempt to sway or change the person from his masochistic traits is met with resentment and or failure. The Satanist does not condemn these people for giving vent to their masochistic desires, but he does feel the utmost contempt for those who cannot be honest enough, at least with themselves, to face and accept their masochism as a natural part of their personality makeup. Having to use religion as an excuse for their masochism is bad enough, but these people actually have the effrontery to feel superior to those who are not bound up in self-deceitful expression of their fetishes. These people would be the first to condemn a man who found his weekly release with a person who would beat him soundly, thereby releasing himself from the very thing which could, if unreleased, make him, as they are, a compulsive churchgoer or religious fanatic. By finding adequate release for his masochistic desires, he no longer needs to debase and deny himself in his every waking moment, as do these compulsive masochists. Satanists are encouraged to indulge in this hypothesis, as they need hurt no one. They were only invented by the Christian Church to ensure guilt on the part of its followers. The Christian Church knows that it is impossible for anyone to avoid committing these sins, as they are all things which we, being human, most naturally do. After inevitably committing these sins, financial offerings to the church in order to pay off God are employed as a sop to the parishioner's conscience. Satan has never needed to quote the rules, because vital natural forces have kept man sinful and intent on preserving himself and his feelings. Nevertheless, demoralizing attempts have been made on his body, being for his soul's sake, which only illustrates how misconceived and misused the labels of indulgence versus compulsion have become. Sexual activity certainly is condoned and encouraged by Satanism, but obviously the fact that it is the only religion which honestly takes this stand is the reason it has been traditionally given so much literary space. Naturally, if most people belong to religions which oppress them sexually, anything written on this provocative subject is going to make for typically if all attempts to sell something via a product or an idea have failed, sex will always sell. The reason for this is that even though people now consciously accept sex as a normal and necessary function, their subconscious is still bound by the taboo which religion has placed upon it. So, again, what is denied is more intensely desired. It is this bugaboo regarding sex which causes the literature devoted to the satanic views of the subject to overshadow all else. The true Satanist is not mastered by sex any more than he is mastered by any of his other desires. As with all other pleasurable things, the Satanist is mastered by the pleasure of sex. It is not the further Symbolically, the victim is destroyed through the working of a hex or curse, which in turn leads to the physical, mental, or emotional destruction of the sacrifice. Ways and means attributable to the magician. The only time the Satanists would perform a human sacrifice would be if it were to serve a twofold purpose. That being to release the magician's wrath and the throwing of a curse, or more importantly, to dispose of totally obnoxious and deserving. Under no circumstances would a Satanist sacrifice any animal or man. For centuries, propagandists on the right hand battling against supposed sacrifices of small children for rituals made into the hands of cannibalists. It would be thought that anyone reading or hearing of these heinous accounts would immediately question their authenticity, taking into consideration the biased sources of the stories. On the contrary, as with all holy lies or accepted moral observation, it is assumed notice on high level Satanism persists to this day. There are sound and logical reasons why the Satanists do not perform such sacrifices. Man, the animal, is the godhead to the Satanists. The purest form of carnal existence opposes all laws of animals and nature, unwilling to deny themselves their natural desires. They can perceive things that the average adult human can never hope to. Therefore, the Satanist holds these animals in a sacred regard, knowing he can learn much from these natural magicians of the world. The Satanist is aware of the universal custom of the treader of the path of the guardian, the killing of the god, and as much as gods are always created in man's own image, and the average man hates what he sees in himself, the inevitable must occur. The sacrifice of the god who represents himself. The Satanist does not hate himself nor the gods he might choose, and has no desire to destroy himself or anything for which he stands. It is for this reason that he never willfully harm an animal or child. The question arises, who, then, should be considered a fit and proper human sacrifice, and how is one qualified to pass judgment on such a person? The answer is brutally simple. Anyone who has unjustly wronged you, anyone who has gone out of his way to hurt you, deliberately cause trouble and hardship for you or those dear to you. In short, a person asking to be cursed by their very actions. When a person by his reprehensible behavior practically cries out to be destroyed, it is truly your moral obligation to indulge them their wish. The person who takes every opportunity to pick on others is often mistakenly called sadistic. In reality, this person is a misdirected masochist who is working towards his own destruction. The reason a person viciously strikes out against you is because they are afraid of you or what you represent, or are resentful of your happiness. They are weak, insecure, and on extremely shaky ground and they make ideal sacrifices. It is sometimes easy to overlook the actual wrongdoing of the victim of your curse when one considers how unhappy the person he really is. It is not so easy though to retrace the damaging footsteps of your antagonist and make right those practical situations he or she has made wrong. The ideal sacrifice may be emotionally insecure, but nonetheless can, in the machinations of his insecurity, cause severe damage to your tranquility or sound reputation. Mental illness, nervous breakdown, maladjustment, anxiety neuroses, broken homes, sibling rivalry, etc. ad infinitum have too long been convenient excuses for vicious and irresponsible actions. Anyone who says we must try to understand those who make life miserable for those undeserving of misery is aiding and abetting a social cancer. The apologists for these rabid humans deserve any clobberings they get at the hands of their charges. Mad dogs are destroyed, and they need help far more than the human who conveniently made froths at the mouth when irrational behavior is in order. It is easy to say, so what? These people are insecure, so they can't hurt me. But the fact remains, given the opportunity, they will destroy you. Therefore, you have every right to symbolically destroy them. And if your curse provokes their actual annihilation, rejoice that you have been instrumental in ridding the world of a pest. If your success or happiness disturbs a person, you owe him nothing. He is made to be trampled underfoot. If people had to take the consequences of their own actions, they would think twice. Life after death through fulfillment. Man is aware that he will die someday. Other animals, when nearing death, know they are about to die, but it is not until death is certain that the animal senses his coming departure from this world. And even then he does not know exactly exactly what is entailed in dying. It is often pointed out that animals accept death gracefully, without fear or resistance. This is a beautiful concept, but one that only holds true in cases where death for the animal is unavoidable. When an animal is sick or injured, he will fight for his life with every ounce of strength he has left. It is this unshakable will to live that, if man were not so highly evolved, would also give him the fighting spirit he needs to stay alive. It is a well-known fact that many people die simply because they give up and just don't care. This is understandable if a person is very ill with no apparent chance for recovery, but this often is not the case. Man has become lazy. He has learned to take the easy way out. Even suicide has become less repugnant to many people than any number of other sins. Religion is totally to blame for this. Death in most religions is touted as a great spiritual awakening, one which is prepared for throughout life. This concept is very appealing to one who has not had a satisfactory life, but to those who have experienced all the joys life has to offer, there is a great dread attached to dying. This is as it should be. It is this lust for life which will allow the vital person to live on after the inevitable death of his fleshy shell. History shows that men who have given their own lives in pursuit of an ideal have been defied for the martyrdom. Religionists and political leaders have been very crafty in laying their plans. By holding the martyr up as a shining example to his fellow men, they eliminate the common sense reaction that willful self-destruction goes against all animal logic. To the Satanist martyrdom and non-personalized heroism is to be associated not with integrity, but with stupidity. This, of course, does not apply to the situations which involve the safety of loved ones. To give one's own life for something as impersonal as political or religious issue is the ultimate masochism. Life is the one great indulgence, death the one great abstinence. To a person who is satisfied with his earthly existence, life is like a party, and no one likes to leave on a good party. By the same token, if a person is enjoying himself here on earth, he will not so readily give up this life for the promise of an afterlife about which he knows nothing. The Eastern mystical beliefs teach humans to discipline themselves against any conscious will for success, so they might dissolve themselves into universal cosmic awareness. Anything to avoid unhealthy self-satisfaction, or honest lying and accomplishments. It is interesting to note that the areas in which this type of belief flourishes are those where material gains are not easily attainable. For this reason, the predominant religious belief must be one which commends its followers for rejection of material things and their avoidance of the use of labels, which attaches a certain amount of importance to material gains. In this way, the people can be pacified into accepting their lot, no matter how small it may be. Satanism uses many labels. If it were not for names, very few of us would understand anything in life, much less attach any significance to it. And significance compels recognition, which is something everyone wants, especially the Eastern mystic who tries to prove to everyone he can meditate longer or stand more deprivation and pain than the next fellow. The Eastern philosophies preach the dissolution of man's ego before he can remove sins. It is unfathomable to the Satanist to conceive of an ego which will willfully choose denial of itself. In countries where this is used as a sop for the willingly impoverished, it is understandable that a philosophy which teaches the denial of the ego would serve a useful purpose, at least for those in power, to whom it would be detrimental if their people were discontented. But for anyone who has every opportunity for material gain, to choose this form of thought seems foolish indeed. The Eastern mystic believes strongly in reincarnation. A person who has virtually nothing in this life, the possibility that he may have been a king in the past life or maybe one in the next life is very attractive, and does much to appease his need for self-respect. If there is nothing in which they can take pride in this life, they can console themselves by thinking, there are always future lives. It never occurs to the believer in reincarnation that if his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather had somehow developed good karmas by their adherence to the same beliefs and ethics as his present ones, then why is he now living in privation rather than like a Maharaja? Belief in reincarnation provides a beautiful fantasy world in which a person can find the proper avenue of ego expression, but at the same time claims to have dissolved his ego. This is emphasized by the roles people choose for themselves in their past or future lives. Believers in reincarnation do not always choose an honorable character. If the person of a highly respectable and conservative nature, he will often choose a colorful rogue or gangster, thereby fulfilling his social status may pick a harlot or a famous courtesan for the characterization of herself in past life. If people were able to divorce themselves from the stigma attached to personal evil fulfillment, they would not need to play self-deceitful games such as belief in reincarnation as a means of satisfying their natural need for evil fulfillment. The Satanist believes in complete gratification of his ego. Satanism, in fact, is the only religion which advocates the intensification or encouragement of the ego. Only if a person's own ego is sufficiently fulfilled can he afford to be kind and complimentary to others without robbing himself of his self-respect. We generally think of a braggart as a person with a large ego. In reality, his bragging results from a need to satisfy his intolerant ego. Religionists have kept their followers in mind by suppressing their egos, making their followers feel inferior. The awesomeness of their god is ensured. Satanism encourages its members to develop a strong ego because it gives them the self-respect necessary for a proper position as a If a person has been vital throughout his life and has fought to the end for his earthly existence, it is this ego which refuses to die even after the expiration of the flesh and childhood. Young children may be admired for their enthusiasm for life. This is exemplified by the small child who refuses to go to bed without something exciting going on, and once put to bed will sneak down the stairs to take his lunch. It is this childlike vitality that will allow the Satanists to peek through the curtain of darkness and death and remain earthbound. Self-sacrifice is not encouraged by the Satanic religion. Therefore, unless death comes as an indulgence because of extreme circumstances which make the termination of life unlikely from unendurable worthwhile existence, suicide is frowned upon by the Satanic religion. Religious martyrs have taken their own lives not because life is intolerable for them, but to use their supreme sacrifice as a tool to further the religious belief. We must assume, then, that suicide, if done for the sake of the church, is condoned and even encouraged, even though their scriptures label it as sin, because religious martyrs of the past have always been found. It is rather curious that for many times suicide is considered sinful by the religions, religious holidays. The highest of all holidays in the Satanic religion is the Day of Life. This is in direct contradiction to the Holy of Holy Days of the religions which defy a particular God who has been created in an anthropomorphic form for their own image, thereby showing that the ego is ordinary. The Satanist feels, really be honest, and if you're going to create a God in your image, why not create that God as yourself? Every man is a God if he chooses to recognize himself as one. So the Satanist celebrates his own birthday as the most important holiday of the year. After all, aren't you happy about the fact that you were born when you are the birth of someone you never even met? Or for that matter, aside from religious holidays, why pay a higher tribute to the birthday of a president or to a date in history than we do to the day we were born into this greatest of all worlds? Despite the fact that some of us may not have been wanted, or at least we're not particularly planned, we're glad, even if no one else is, that we're here. You should give yourself a pat on the back, buy yourself whatever you want, treat yourself like the king or god that you are, and generally celebrate your birthday with as much pomp and ceremony as possible. After one's own birthday, the two other Satanic holidays are Rationality and Halloween, or Hallow's Eve. Satan will bring us or will purge depending on the time of the reign. He was born in Sussex about the end of the 7th and beginning of the 8th century, and was educated at Warsaw, where after taking the veil, she remained for 25 years. She then, at the instance of her St. Boniface and her brother St. Symbolic, set out along with some other nuns to found religious houses in Germany. The first settlement was at Bischofsheim, in the Diocese of Mainz, and 2 years later, 1754, she became the best of the Benedictine nunnery at Heidelberg, within her brother Willibald's Diocese of Reichstadt in Bavaria, where another brother Willibald had at the same time also remained in another monastery. On the death of Willibald in 760, she succeeded him in his charge, retaining the superintendence of both houses until her death in 1779. Her relics were translated to Iceland, where she was laid in a hollow rock from which exuded a kind of bituminous oil, and afterwards rose from purgatory, regarded as having miraculous efficacy against disease. The cave became a place of pilgrimage, where the church was built with respect. She is commemorated at various times, but or unusually active in compliance. Paradoxically, all Hallows Eve is also the night that young people performed magical rituals to determine their future marriage partners. The youth of the village is carried on with much merrymaking and sensual revelry. The older people take great care to safeguard their homes from the use of magic, witches and demons or deception powers them. The solstices and equinoxes are also celebrated this holidays as they herald the first day of the seasons. The difference between a solstice and an equinox is a semantic one, defining the relationship between the sun, moon, and fixed stars. The solstice applies to summer and winter. The equinox refers to autumn and spring. The summer solstice is in June, and the winter solstice is in December. The autumn equinox is in September, and the spring equinox is in March. Both the equinoxes and the solstices vary a day or two from year to year, depending on the lunar cycle at the time, but usually fall on the 21st or the 22nd of the month. 5 to 6 weeks after these days, the legendary Satanic revels are celebrated. The Black Mass. No other single device has been associated with Satanism as much as the Black Mass. To say that the most blasphemous of all religious ceremonies is nothing more than a literary invention is certainly a statement which needs qualifying, but nothing could be truer. The popular concept of the Black Mass is thus: a defrocked priest stands before an altar consisting of a nude woman, her legs spread-eagled, and vagina thrust open. Each of her outstretched fists grasping a black candle made from the fat of unbaptized babies, and a chalice containing the urine of a prostitute, or blood, reposing on her belly. An inverted cross hangs above the altar, and triangular hosts of ergo-laden bread or black-stained turnip are methodically blessed as the priest beautifully slips them in and out of the altar lady's labia. Then, we are told, an invocation to Satan with various demons is followed by an array of prayers and psalms chanted backwards or interspersed with obscenities, all performed with sexualize and dehumanize the pagan beliefs, later men of spiritual faith whitewashed the honest meanings behind the rituals into the bland euphemisms now considered to be the true mass. Even if the Satanist were to spend each night performing the black mass, he would no more be a travesty than a devout churchgoer who unwittingly attends his own black mass, his sleep for honest and emotionally sound minds. Any Satanic concern black mass must effectively shock and outrage as it seems to be the measure of its success. The Middle Ages blaspheming the Holy Church was shocking. Now, however, the Church does not present a lost image deep during the Inquisition. The traditional black mass is no longer an outrageous spectacle for dilettantes or renegade priest even once was. If the Satanist wishes to use a ritual to blaspheme and accept an institution for the purpose of sacred honor, he is careful to choose one that is not in vogue to their end. Thus, he is truly stepping on a sacred cow. A black mass, today, would consist of blaspheming of such sacred topics as Eastern mysticism, psychiatry, the psychedelic movement, ultra-liberalism, and sound. Patriotism would be championed, drugs that are unreasonably defiant, fake cultural militants would be defined, and the decadence of ecclesiastical theologies would even be given a symbolic boost. The Satanic madness has always been a catalyst for the dichotomy necessary in this case, a ceremonial nature of the madness being served on its far-reaching magical purpose. In the year 1666, some rather interesting events occurred in France. The death of Francois Mansart, the architect of the Traverse pacts are those employed by the most self-realized and powerful humans on Earth. In the secret thoughts of each man and woman still motivated by sound and unclouded minds resides the potential of the Satanist, as always has been. The sign of the horn shall appear to many now, rather than before, and the magician will stand forth and be recognized. Earth, the book of blood, the mastery of the earth. The greatest appeal of magic is not in its application, but in its esoteric meanderings. The element of mystery which so heavily enshrouds the practice of the black arts has been fostered, deliberately or out of ignorance, by those who often claim honest expertise in such matters. If the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, then established occultists would do well as mazemakers. The basic principles of ceremonial magic have been relegated for so long to infinitely classified bits of scholastic mysticism that the would-be wizard becomes the victim of the very art of misdirection which he himself should be employing. An analogy may be drawn with a student of applied psychology who, though knowing all of the answers, cannot make friends. What good is a study of falsehoods unless everyone believes in falsehoods? Many, of course, do believe in falsehoods, but still act according to natural law. It is upon this premise that Satanic magic is based. This is a primer, a basic text on materialistic magic. It is a Satanic McGuffey's reader. By all means without a mask, eyes are ready to learn. I can form a clear image of the sweet beauty of the She can employ the art of misdirection to accomplish her goals. The third category is commitment. This category will blindly lure in strange or by making her strangely powerful, she can manipulate people simply because they are fearful of the consequences should they indulge in madness. Many women fit into either one of these categories. reason is frighteningly simple. The uncivilized tribesman is the first to run to his nearest witch doctor or shaman when he feels a curse has been placed upon him by an enemy. The threat and presence of harm is with him consciously, and belief in the power of the curse is so strong that he will take every precaution against it. Thus, with the application of sympathetic magic, he will counteract any harm that might come his way. This man is watching his step and not taking any chances. On the other hand, the enlightened man who doesn't place any stock in such superstition relegates his instinctive fear of the curse to his unconscious, thereby nourishing it into a phenomenally destructive force that will multiply with each succeeding misfortune. Of course, every time a new setback occurs, the non-believer will automatically deny any connection with the curse, especially to himself. The emphatic conscious denial of the potential of the curse is the very ingredient that will create its success through setting up of accident situations. In many instances, the victim will deny any magical significance to his fate, even unto his dying gasp, although the magician is perfectly satisfied so long as his desired results occur. It must be remembered that it matters not whether anyone attaches any significance to your working, so long as the result of the working are in accordance with your will. The super-logician will always explain the connection of the magical ritual to the end result as coincidence. Whether magic is performed for constructive or destructive purposes, the success of the operation is dependent on the receptivity of the person who is to receive the blessing or curse, as the case may be. In the case of a sex or compassion ritual, it helps if the recipient has faith and believes in magic, but the victim of a hex or curse is much more prone to destruction if he does not believe in it. So long as man knows the meaning of fear, he will need the ways and means to defend himself against his fears. No one knows everything, and as long as there is wonder, there will always be an apprehension of the unknown, where there are potentially dangerous forces. It is this natural fear of the unknown, the first cousin to the fascination towards the unknown, that impels the man of logic towards his very explanations. Obviously, the man of science is motivated to discovery by his very sense of wonder, and yet how sad that this man, faithful ask, is there no defense against such witchery? It must be answered thus. Yes, there is protection. You must never sleep, never daydream, never be without a vital thought, and never have an open mind. Then you shall be protected from the forces of magic. C. The adolescent boy who takes great care in carving on a tree a heart containing his and his love objects' initials. The little chap who sits by the hour drawing his conception of sleep on the walls. The tiny girl who rocks a stuffed and ragged doll in her arms and thinks of it as her beautiful little baby. These capable witches and warlocks, these natural magicians, are employing the magical ingredient of this imagery, and the success of any ritual depends on it. Children, not knowing or caring if they possess artistic skill or other creative talents, pursue their goals by using imagery of their own in fashion, whereas civilized adults are much more critical of their own creative methods. This is why a primitive magician can utilize a mud doll or crude drawing to a successful advantage in his magical ceremonies. To him, the image is as accurate as a human being. Anything which serves to intensify autoerotic means necessary. After orgasm is obtained, return to the location of the altar and proceed with step number 11. B. To ensure help or success for one who has your sympathy or compassion, including yourself. Remain in close proximity of the altar and with as vivid a mental image as possible of the person you wish to help or intend self-pity. State your desire in your own terms. Should your emotions be genuine enough, they will be accompanied with the shedding of tears, which should be allowed to flow without restraint. After this exercise and sentiment is completed, proceed to step number 11. C. To cause the destruction of an enemy. Remain in the area of the altar unless imagery is more easily obtained in another spot, such as in the vicinity of the victim. Producing the image of the victim, proceed to inflict the destruction upon the effigy in the manner of your choice. This can be done in the following ways. F. Sticking of pins or nails into a doll representing your victim. The doll may be cloth, wax, wood, vegetable matter, etc. G. The creation of graphic imagery depicting the method of your victim's destruction, drawings, paintings, etc. H. The creation of a vivid literary description of your victim's ultimate end. I. A detailed soliloquy directed at the intended victim describing his torments and annihilation. J. Mutilation, injury, infliction of pain or illness by proxy using any other means or devices desired. Intense calculated hatred and disdain should accompany this step with this end. And no attempt should be made to stop this step until the expended energy results in a state of relative exhaustion. When the exhaustion ensues, proceed to step number 11. 11. A. If requests are written, they are now read aloud by the priest and then burned in the flames of the appropriate prayer. Shemham Frosh and Hail Satan is said after each request. B. If requests are given verbally to participants one at a time, now tell them to the priest, and then repeat chalice cannot be obtained, one made from another metal, glass, or crockery may be used. Anything but gold. Gold has always been associated with white light religions in the heavenly realm. The chalice is to be drunk from first by the priest, then by one assistant. In private rituals, the person performs the chalice. The stimulating fluid or elixir of life used by the pagans has been corrupted into sacramental water by the Christian faith. Originally, the liquor used in pagan rituals was drunk to relax and intensify the emotions to the soul. Satanism does not sacrifice its god as do all religions. The Satanist practices no such form of symbolic cannibalism or turns the sacramental water used by the Christians to its original purpose, that of stimulating the emotions necessary to satanic ritual. Drink itself cannot be used. Whatever drink is more stimulating to the palate. The elixir of life is to be drunk from the chalice of ecstasy, as indicated above, immediately following the invocation to Satan. Sword. The sword of power is symbolic of present force and acts as an extension and intensifier of the wand with which the priest uses to gesture and point. Parallel to this is the pointing stick or plastic wand used in other forms of magical ritual. The sword is held by the priest and is used to point toward the symbol of Baphomet during the invocation of Satan. It is also used as indicated in steps of ritual, calling forth the forces of hell. The priest thrusts the point of the sword through the parchment containing the message or request or the vow. It is then used to hold the parchment while introduced into the candle flame. While hearing the request of other participants and while repeating same, the priest places the sword atop their heads in traditional Roman fashion. For private rituals, if the sword cannot be obtained, the long knife, cane, sword, or staff may be used. Phallus. The phallus is a pagan fertility symbol that represents generations of reproduction. This is yet another device that has been blasphemously condemned and implemented in ceremonies of Christianity. The phallus is a non-implemented version of the masculine or open water spirit used in Catholicism, quite a metamorphosis of the common. The phallus is held in both hands on one of the priest's assistants, the man is shaken twice to repeat the benediction of the house. Any phallus symbol can be used. Now this included one may be named for pastor, play, relax, etc. The phallus is necessary in all rituals. The gong is used to call on the forces of darkness. It is to be struck once after the participants of the pagan rites feel as near to Satan. The gong is necessary only to organize these rituals. The best drum quality or concert gong is preferred if one cannot be obtained any gong for full ritual. Parchment is used because its organic properties are compatible with gongs in nature, keeping the satanic views of sacrifice of sheep, which is by necessity killed for food. The animal is never slaughtered for the rites and is all part of the ritual. If the worship parchment reaches the age of already slaughtered sheep cannot be obtained. Parchment is the means by which the written message or request can be consumed by the candle flame and sent out into the ether. The request is written on parchment or paper when allowed by the priest and then burned in the flame of either the black or white candle, whichever is appropriate for the particular request. Before the ritual begins, curses are placed to the right of the priest and charms or blessings are placed to the left of him. 1. The Book of Life. The Raging Sin. Despite all non-verbalist protests to the contrary, soaring heights of emotional ecstasy or raging pains of anguish can be attained through verbal communication. If the magical ceremony is to employ all sensory awarenesses, then the proper sounds must be invoked. It is certainly true that actions speak louder than words, but words become as monuments to thoughts. Perhaps the most noticeable shortcoming in the printed magical conjurations of the past is the lack of emotion developed upon the recital of them. An old wizard known to the author who was once employing the self-composed invocation of a great person meaning the right of his magical desires and out of words, just as his ritual was only short of its successful culmination. Aware of the necessity of keeping his emotional response generated, he quickly ad-libbed the first emotion-provoking words that just and curse the rotten. By all the gods of the pit, I command that these things of which I speak shall come to pass. Come forth and answer to your names by manifesting my desires. Oh, hear the names! The infernal names are listed here in alphabetical order, merely to simplify reform. Calling the names, all of them may be recited, and a given number of forth, O great spawn of the abyss, and make thy presence manifest. I have set my thoughts upon the blazing pinnacle which glows with the chosen life, in moments of increase and growth of fervent eternal sweat. Send forth that risen earth that crystallites, and let these obscene vistas of my dark desires take form in future deeds and doings. From the sixth tower of Satan there shall come a sign which joineth with these salts within, and as such will move the body of the flesh of my summoning. I have gathered forth my symbols and prepare my doctrines of the is to be, and the image of my creation lurketh as a sea being bathrooms, awaiting its release. The vision shall become as reality, and through the nourishment that my sacrifice giveth, the angles of the first dimension shall become the substance of the third. Go out into the void of night, and pierce that mind that respondeth with thoughts which leadeth to the paths of new abandon. My rod is a thrust, the penetrating force of my venom shall shatter the sanctity of that mind which is barren of lust. And if the seed falleth, so shall its fables spread within that reeling brain, benumbing it to helplessness according to my will. In the name of the great god Pan, may my secret thoughts be marshaled into the movements of the flesh of that which I desire. Shebhamfra shall Satan. My loins are aflame, the dripping of the nectar from my eager cleft shall act as pollen to that slumbering brain, and the mind that feels not love shall on a sudden deal with crazed impulse. When my mighty surge is spent, narration shall begin, and that flesh which I desire shall come to me. In the names of the great harlot of Babylon, and of Lilith, of Akkad, may my lust be fulfilled, Shebhamfra shall save it. Invocation of the mighty voices of my vengeance smash the stillness of the air and stand as monoliths of wrath upon a plain of violent serpents. I am become as a monstrous machine of annihilation to the festering fragments of the body of he or she who would detain me. It repenteth me now that my summons doth ride upon the plastic winds which multiply the stings of my bitterness, and great black slimy shapes shall rise from the brackish pits and vomit forth the postulates into his or her puny brain. I call upon the messengers of doom to slash with grim delight his victim I have chosen. Silent is that voiceless bird that feeds upon the brain pulp of him or her who hath tormented me, and the agony of the is-to-be shall sustain itself in shrieks of pain, only to serve as signals of warning to those who would resent my being. Oh, come forth in the name of Abaddon, and destroy him or her whose name I giveth as a sign. O great brothers of the night, thou who makest my place of comfort, who rideth out upon the hot winds of hell, who dwelleth in the devil's fane, move and appear, present yourselves to him or her who sustaineth the rightness of the mind, that moves the quivering mouth, that mocks the just and strong. Rend that dazzling tongue, and close his or her throat. O Kali, pierce his or her lungs with the stings of scorpions. O Sekhmet, plunge his or her substance into the dismal void. Almighty Dagon, I thrust aloft the mythic bar of hell, and on its tines resplendently impaled my sacrifice through vengeance rests. Shebhamfra, hail Satan! my hands and brighten your vestments with infernal light. I made ye a law to govern the holy ones, and delivered a rod of wisdom supreme. Lift your voices and swear your allegiance to him that liveth triumphant, whose beginning is not, nor end cannot be, which sitteth as a flame in the midst of your palaces, and reigneth amongst you as the balance of life. Move therefore, and appear, open the mysteries of your creation. Be friendly unto me, for I am the saint, the true worshipper of the highest and ineffable King of hell. The second key. In order to pay homage to the very lusts which sustain the continuance of life itself, the second Enochian key extends this recognition of our earthly heritage unto a talisman of power. Can the wings of the winds hear your voices of wonder? Oh, you, the great spawn of the worms of the earth, whom the hellfire frames in the depths of my jaws, whom I have prepared as cups for a wedding, or as flowers regaling the chambers of lust. Stronger are your feet than the barren stone, mightier are your voices than the manifold winds, for you are become as a building such as is not, save in the mind of the all-powerful manifestation of Satan. Arise, saith the first, move therefore into his servants, show yourselves in power, and make me a strong seer of things, for I am of him that liveth forever. The third key. The third Enochian key establishes the leadership of the earth upon the hands of those great satanic magicians who throughout the successive ages have held dominion over the peoples of the world. Behold, saith Satan, I am a circle on whose hands stand the 12 kingdoms. 6 are the seats of living breath, the rest are as sharp as sickles or the horns of death. Therein the creatures of earth are and are not, except in mine own hands which sleep and shall rise. In the first I made ye stewards and placed ye in the 12 seats of government, giving unto every one of you power successively over the 9 true ages of time, so that from the highest vessel and the corners of your governments you might work my power, pouring down the fires of life and increase continually on the earth. Thus you are become the skirts of justice and truth. In Satan's name rise up, show yourselves, behold, his mercies flourish and his name is become mighty among us, in whom we say, move, ascend, and apply yourselves unto us as the partakers of his secret wisdom in your creation. The fourth Enochian key refers to the cycling of the ages of time. I have set my feet in the south and have looked about me, saying, are not the thunders of increase those which reign in the second angle, under whom I have placed those whom none hath yet numbered, but one, in whom the second beginnings of things are and wax strong, successively adding the numbers of time, and their powers that stands the first of the 9. Arise, you sons of pleasure, and visit the earth, for I am the Lord your God, which is and liveth forever. In the name of Satan, move and show yourselves as pleasant deliverers, and you may praise him among the sons of men. The fifth key. The fifth Enochian key affirms the satanic basic and traditional priesthood the mighty sounds have entered into the third angle and are becoming the seedlings of thunders of wrath does slumber in the north in the likeness of an oak whose branches are dung-filled nests of lamentation and weeping laid up for their oath, which burn night and day and vomit out the heads of scorpions and lie sulphur mingled with poison. These be the thunders that in an instant roar with 100 mighty armies and 1,000 as many sergeants, and trust not, nor know any time here. One rock bringeth forth 1,000, even as the heart of man doth his thoughts. Woe, woe, yea, woe be to the earth, for her iniquity as it was and shall be great. Come away, be not your mighty sounds. The 11th and 13th kings used to herald the coming of the dead and establish a sustenance beyond the grave, to bind to the earth a funeral calling. The mighty throne ground and the reliant thunders the fluid to the angels spake and cried loud, come away from the house of death. They gathered themselves together and became those who and the deathless ones who ride their wings. Come away, for I have prepared a place for you. Move therefore and show yourselves. Reveal the mysteries of the Be according to the providence of him that sitteth on the infernal throne, and rise up in the beginning, saying, the earth, let her be governed by her parts, and let there be division in her. The glory of her may be always drunken and vexed in itself. Her course, let it run with the fulfillment of lust. And as a handmaiden, let her serve her. One season, let it confound another, and let there be no creature upon or within her the same. All her members, let them differ in their qualities, and let there be no creature equal with another. The reasonable creatures of the earth and men, let them vex and weed out one another, and their dwelling places, let them forget their names. The work of man and his pomp, let them be defaced. His buildings, let them become caves for the beasts of the field. Comfort her understanding in darkness, for why it repenteth me that I have made man. One will let her be known, and another a stranger, because she is in the bed of a harlot and the dwelling place of Lucifer the king. Open wide the gates of hell, the lower heavens beneath you, let them serve you. Govern those who govern, cast down such as fall, bring forth those that increase and destroy the rotten. No place let it remain in one number, add and diminish until the stars be numbered. Arise, move, and appear before the covenant of his mouth, which he hath sworn unto us in his justice. Open the mysteries of your creation, and make us partakers of the undefiled wisdom.